Thank you for your stamina. Thank you for your intelligence. Thank you for hanging in there on all sorts of levels of écoute and zuhören, in all sorts of languages that are being marked and unmarked, according to all sorts of psychic inflections and dents and static on the line of transmission. We are not assured of having a command over what gets heard, what gets through, what is retained for a while, what is refused arrival, what might arrive in a few years or in a dream or in another sector of unconscious receptivity. And today we've heard some truly remarkable presentations, and we're now ready to listen to our last or first presentations according to some of the recursive looping that we might want to implement. So there will have been a lot to think about. The expectation is that a lot of perhaps things will have been broken down and even destroyed so that some things can open up rather than close down as we wrap. And the wish is to be able to welcome again and differently each time and uniquely each time the signatures and the sonic intrusions even of what we're calling Friedrich Kittler. The last speaker switched from Friedrich to Kittler in a very poignant resolve that we want to be attentive to as well. So for the last or first or middle talks that we're privileged to be here to receive, I ask that Jacob Dentz moderate. He's a very, very brilliant, stellar Übergraduate student in the Germanische department here. Some of you had a little shit to say about Germanistic, and I'm prepared to respond to that, because imagine the aberration and perversity of Germanistic here in New York City. We're happy to kind of sail under the banner of whatever destruction or kind of renovation and overhaul is imagined by something like German studies, which is always precarious for us, always embarrassing. You know, the motif of shame was brought up a few times, but very importantly, there's something about not being proud of being associated with what you're doing. And that's something that we carry, I think, with some honorable humiliation in this department and in this city. So we'll be happy to talk about that. Some of you look a little puzzled by what I said. Maybe it was a little too dense. I'm usually a cheerleader, so this might come as a surprise. Yeah. Attack or ambush. I'm not disavowing. Okay, let me make this clear. I'm not disavowing. This is the strongest possible affirmation of being in an impossible discipline and being disciplined by it and gebildet in certain ways that do include torture and toilet training. Okay, so we can talk about this. I'd be happy to give my presentation on what I just said, as you can tell. But right now, I'm actually going to pass the mic because Jacob demands it, I can tell. Okay.
Thank you so much, Avital. You're so kind. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to moderate this final panel of the conference, of such a moving conference as it begins to snow outside also. Seems very beautiful and fitting somehow. So anyway, good afternoon, meine Damen und Herren. Yeah. Thank you so much. I just also wanted to mention that this panel will also be shorter than was anticipated because unfortunately Thomas Pepper wasn't able to make it to the conference. But I'm very happy to introduce two speakers. First, Antje Pfannkuchen is assistant professor of German at Dickinson College, where her research interests focus on the mutual influence among media technology, science, literature, and art. Antje has published on Ezra Pound's interest in 19th century science, as well as Georg Christoph Lichtenberg's influence on the invention of photography. Antje worked and studied here with Avital Ronell and received her PhD in 2010, which means that unfortunately I was not able to meet her myself until just yesterday, so I was very happy to meet you. Antje also studied with and under and worked for 4 years as Friedrich Kittler's research assistant, and today her talk is entitled A Return to Kittler, Romanticism and Writing. So please join me in welcoming Antje Pfannkuchen.
Thank you to Avital and Arne specifically for inviting me here and thereby forcing me out of the role of silence that I've assumed for a long time because I read it as the one that was assigned to me. I'm now beginning to wonder to what extent I might have misread that assignment. And what I will do here now is I'll present a rather personal report from one of his Berlin students. We've had the Freiburg students and the EGS students, and so I now take on the role of one of the Berlin students. I also thank every one of you who have made it through this very interesting but also exhausting conference and held on until the end. As Avital put it on Thursday, Kittler had a problem with women and he left troves of ambivalence. This expressed a lot of the issues I've been having with him that all bubbled up when I tried to prepare this talk. But I am also happy to see that this meeting here has turned at times into a sort of talking cure with Dr. Avital. So in that sense, I will talk about my own story with Kittler, a sort of biogeography, as Bernard Dotzler called it, or to quote him, quoting Kittler, eine empirische Erzählung, wie man der Zufall wird, der man ist. An empirical tale or story, how one becomes the coincidence that one is. The one thing that's clear is that Kittler is one of the main, or even the main reason that I got into academia. But he's also one of the main reasons for why I left Germany, because, as has been mentioned, he didn't care. And for some reason, I took that personal and felt there was no place for me in German academia. The good thing about leaving Germany, of course, was that I half sent myself and was half sent by Kittler to Avital Ronell. And while I first had to have my New York moment by going to art school, it is thanks to her that I found my way back into this academia that I'm speaking in today. So a double thank you to Avital again for having me here and for enabling me to be here. After initially getting worked up over my ambivalences, I decided to return to my first moment of enchantment with Kittler. That has, to an extent that I almost forgot, made me and informed my work in such significant ways that I'm now almost ready to forgive him all the rest. Despite the fact that there are no origins, there is love at first sight. And that was what happened to me when I was a rather clueless and aimless student at the FU Berlin in the early 90s. I had somehow found my way to the Sondi Institute for Comparative Literature, which at the time resided in a picturesque villa on Hüttenweg. In a course, Einführung in die AVL, Introduction to Complete, with Winfried Menninghaus, actually, I first read Kittler. And I still remember that at the time there was a Grundsatzdiskussion, a fairly intense discussion going on at this AVL Institute about the advantages and disadvantages of canonization and if the canon that everyone knew existed should be formalized into a reading list for students or not. And it was Winfried Menninghaus who, as far as I understood, against many of his colleagues, insisted that on a, I think it was like a top 20 or 25 list of books to read for a complete student. So Menninghaus insisted that Kittler's Aufschreibesysteme 1800-1900, the discourse networks 1800-1900 belonged on this list. For serendipitous reasons, in this introductory course with Menninghaus, I signed up for the Referat, the presentation, to be given on a passage from the Kittler text, not knowing what I was in for. From that moment on, I've been fascinated by and struggling with Kittler for all the reasons that have been mentioned here before. Rereading the Aufschreibesysteme now, I relished the breathtaking dance, but it is a complete mystery to me how I was able to make any kind of sense of it as the second or third semester student I was during this first encounter. The Aufschreibesysteme were written, as many here of course know, to be Kittler's Habilitation. The title Aufschreibesysteme was a borrowed neologism from the civil servant psychotic Daniel Paul Schreber, who used it in his own rehabilitation. Judge Schreber had reached the highest public standing of Senate president before he became delusional in the same city of Dresden, where we will soon see student Anselmus hallucinating under a blossoming elder tree. Schreber was able to reinstate his own legal status, in other words, reverse his legal incapacitation and Mündigung, with his Denkwürdigkeiten eines Nervenkranken, memoirs of my nervous illness. To this scholarly reader, the work, quoting again, misses in principle the scholarly discourse. In part, in fairly large part, it is not even rational discourse. In German, die Arbeit verfehlt prinzipiell den wissenschaftlichen Diskurs. Zum Teil, ziemlich weithin, ist es nicht einmal rationaler Diskurs. He does admit that it is not so much a missing of the discourse, as this would have implied an aiming at it, but a fundamental refusal of what he perceives as scholarly seriousness. Even without knowing what Kittler shared in one of his last interviews, namely that the first part on Goethe's Faust was written under the influence, as prudent Americans would call it, bekifft, stoned, in his own words, most readers would agree that rational scholarly discourse is not the foremost category of the Aufschreibesysteme. Kittler performed in it the double life of the poet, public servant that he described as a central theme for the Aufschreibesystem 1800, the discourse network 1800. And it remains a kind of coup that he was able to eventually get approval for disabilitation, which allowed him to become a public servant himself. Considering that, and now quoting from the Aufschreibesysteme, states demand a commitment from their servants that forbids poetizing and fictionalizing. Staaten fordern eben von ihren Dienern eine Verbindlichkeit, die Poetisierung und Fiktionalisierung untersagt. Poetizing and fictionalizing, or literarisierung, are precisely the accusations coming from the harshest critic, who makes it clear that his complaints are not about stylistic poetizing, quote, against which nothing or little could be objected. He is outraged about fictionalization in the substance, Literarisierung in der Substanz selbst. Only in poetry and fiction, so his argument, it is permissible to stage and suggest instead to reason. In Kittler's case, nothing than reading this critical and entirely very scholarly evaluation next to the Aufschreibesysteme makes it only too clear why Kittler got all the girls, students at the university. His writing is sexy and doesn't care about following academic rules. It is fresh, brazen, and outrageous. The only other person writing as radically and sassy who has managed to smuggle herself into the heart of academia is Avital, I think. I was definitely one of the young students who became hooked by it. When Kittler arrived in Berlin, shortly after my first encounter with his writing, I became an attentive but mostly silent student in his seminars, with the one exception that in a course on Krieg und Medien, Media and War, I picked, just as serendipitously as I had picked the Aufschreibesysteme before, I hadn't even read it when the seminar began, the presentation on Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. Either that presentation, and possibly my Saxon accent in presenting it, or my otherwise silent attentiveness in class that allowed him to speak, somehow got me invited to the Oberseminar, as he called his Doktoranden-Colloquium. I actually met many of the speakers of this conference here for the first time there. Arriving in this Oberseminar made me, still only in my third or fourth semester of university, feel utterly inadequate and continued a story of fascination and struggle and silence on my part. Speaking of the Saxon dialect, I was also an outsider in that regard. Kittler and co. had performed a triumphant West German takeover of the formerly East German Humboldt University. And while I was proud to somehow become part of it, especially when I was turned into a Hiwi, the research assistant, I also always felt as an outsider. Thinking about it now, I realized there must have been some remnant of my East German upbringing that drew me to the subversive parts of Kittler's discourse, but kept me highly suspicious of any alliance with power. In many respects, I always preferred the margins. So what I will do now is read some of the margins of the Aufschreibesysteme, this book that first got me hooked, and on the way, I'll try to work through some of my own lingering romanticism. In Kittler's Aufschreibesystem, or discourse network of 1800, the roles were clearly divided. Quote from the Aufschreibesysteme: "The difference between the sexes coincided in a mathematically exact way with the dichotomy between writing and authorhood on the one hand, and with that between the voice and motherhood on the other. The difference allowed the woman as the mother's mouth every right to be a voice, but no right to have one." In other words, as Kittler also phrased it, the function of nature woman consists in getting people, that is men, to speak. Woman produces discourses without ever saying a word by seducing men into speaking. Kittler's trope to describe this constellation is the Muttermund, only half appropriately translated as the mother's mouth. Literally, in German, the Muttermund is the anatomical term for ostium uteri, the uterine orifice. This choice of metaphor implies and causes an erotically charged birthing process that in this case produces children as readers. The Muttermund, mother's mouth, becomes the partial object, Partialobjekt, that turns learning how to read into an erotic experience. Kittler reads the educational reforms of 1800 as a process that installed mothers as the first teachers of their children and that simultaneously rewrote the whole science of education and language acquisition. I mostly have the German versions of quotes on the screen, so I'm reading the English. Where earlier analphabetics learned to read, mothers now first learn to know their own mouths. Auto-experimental phonetic practice first established the mother's mouth with its passages, hollows, and depths. And children, instead of attending to books or philanthropic letter games, were all eyes and ears for the instrumental presentations of this mouth. In the passage from the Aufschreibesysteme I first read and presented in my complete class, Kittler exemplified or acted out his system of 1800 on E.T. Hoffmann's Der goldene Topf, the golden pot. He retreats to an elder tree at the banks of the river Elbe in Dresden, railing against his fate. But his soliloquy is interrupted by a strange rustling and whisking, which rose close by him in the grass, but soon glided up into the twigs and leaves of the elder tree that stretched out over his head. It was as if the evening wind were shaking the leaves, as if little birds were twittering among the branches, moving their little wings in capricious flutter to and fro. That was a direct quote from Hoffmann. To Anselmus, listening harder and harder, these sounds grew to faint and half-scattered words, whose onomatopoetic murmur does not entirely translate into English. This time I have the English on the screen. Zwischendurch, zwischenein, zwischen Zweigen, zwischen schwellenden Blüten, schwingen, schlängen, schlingeln wir uns. Schwesterlein, Schwesterlein, schwinge dich im Schimmer, schnell, schnell herauf, herab. Abendsonne schießt Strahlen, zischelt der Abendwind, raschelt der Tau. Blüten singen, rühren wir Zünglein, singen wir mit Blüten und Zweigen. Sterne bald glänzen, müssen herab, zwischendurch, zwischenein, schlängeln, schlingen, schwingen wir uns Schwesterlein. This confused and confusing speech that Anselmus tries to ascribe to the evening wind, which tonight truly is whispering distinctly enough, suddenly materializes itself with the sounding of a triple harmony of crystal bells into three little snakes, glittering with green and gold, twisted around the branches and stretching out their heads to the evening sun. One of them holds out her, in German grammatically, the snake, die Schlange, is not only for a collaboration with Eve, feminine, so she holds out her little head to him, which has an immediate effect on Anselmus. Through all his limbs there went a shock like electricity. He quivered in his inmost heart. He kept gazing up, and a pair of glorious dark blue eyes were looking at him with unspeakable longing. And an unknown feeling of highest blessedness and deepest sorrow nearly rent his heart asunder. That was also a direct quote from Hoffmann. This electric shock came not only through romantic blue flower-like eyes, it came also out of a scientific field en vogue at the time, called galvanism, one that isn't part of Kittler's reading, but one that is very much connected to the later media technology. The subversive spark conducted through snake eyes and oscillating between two poles of the highest and lowest feelings made Anselmus fall head over heels for the little snakes that he hasn't singularized yet, and when, quote, a hoarse, deep voice, as from a great distance, called them home, the student clung to the tree in such despair that some decent burghers passing by couldn't quite decide if he was ill or intoxicated. Such was, in Kittler's reading of the scene, Anselmus' initiation as an auditory hallucination of the mother's mouth, eine halluzinatorische Audition des Muttermundes. In Kittler's new education model of the Austreibesystem 1800, children followed their erotically charged mother's mouth with as rapt an attention as Anselmus' insinuations of the three little motherless snakes that met him in the elder bush as I followed Kittler. In the through and through motherless story of the golden pot, in this story of fathers and daughters, only one evil nurse gets a role. The little snakes and daughters take over as the mother's mouth and the voice of nature. After their oral in his initiation, Anselmus, on his way to become a romantic poet, only needs to learn how the voice that was originally nature can be made into a book without having the vision collapse into mere letters. For this, he becomes an apprentice of Archivarius Lindhorst, the little snake's father. In Lindhorst's library, the student encounters different versions of books of nature. He eventually learns to make his own from writings that seem to spring up directly from nature. Working for Archivarius Lindhorst, a strange, remarkable man of whom, quote, people say he follows all manner of secret sciences, Anselmus first learned that all he has learned before isn't worth much. When he showed examples of his best handwriting that he brought to demonstrate his talents, they suddenly looked terrible, even to his own eyes, the Schönschrift. But he's a quick learner, helped by some good old Rhinish that Lindhorst serves for supper, and even more by the little snake Serpentina, who has by now singularized herself away from her two sisters, the copying of even the most difficult manuscripts went forward much better, indeed faster and easier than he could comprehend. His success is especially surprising when he is put before the decisive test, when Lindhorst leads him to the chamber where the masters of Bhagavad Gita are waiting for us, to transcribe, or rather paint, certain works, quoting from Hoffmann, written in a peculiar character. Pulling a leaf from a palm tree that turns out to be a roll of parchment, Lindhorst spreads it out before Anselmus, who wondered not a little at these strangely intertwisted characters, studying the many little points, strokes, dashes, and twirls in the manuscript that seem to resemble sometimes plants, sometimes mosses, sometimes animal forms. He almost lost hope of ever copying it. This originary script, the mythic beginning of all writing, so Kittler, can be recognized because it is no writing yet. No one could write or read this text, this writing without alphabet in which signs, signifiers, and signifieds are identical. That was a quote from the Aufschreibesysteme, discourse networks. Lindhorst's claim that the plant and animal hieroglyphics that he placed before his despairing secretary are the work of the masters of Bhagavad Gita and so constitute a text in Sanskrit gives the parchment in Kittler's reading, consequently, the same status as the handwritten text of Nostradamus in Faust, which is a foreign language text and a revelation of nature. End of the Kittler quote. What Kittler overlooks in this comparison is that Nostradamus always wrote in Latin letters, so while his writings might not have been easily comprehensible, every European copyist could have transcribed them without too much trouble. Anselmus' test piece, on the other hand, contained twisted strokes of foreign characters, Sanskrit, that remained hieroglyphs to all but the most advanced readers. The Bhagavad Gita was first translated into any European language in 1785 by the English Orientalist Charles Wilkins. The earliest translations into German were provided by the Schlegel brothers, in part after the Golden Pot had been written. So the oscillation between a foreign culture and a foreign nature connects the Sanskrit characters much more than to Nostradamus to Egyptian hieroglyphs that were not to be deciphered until 1822, but also to another kind of hieroglyph that captivated Hoffmann's contemporaries. The poet and mining engineer Friedrich von Hardenberg, better known as Novalis, described the great cipher code in the opening passage of his Die Lehrlinge zu Sais, the novices or apprentices at Sais. Various are the roads of man. He who follows and compares them will see strange figures emerge, figures which seem to belong to that great cipher which we discern written everywhere, in wings, eggshells, clouds, and snow, in crystals and in stone formations, on ice-covered waters, on the inside and outside of mountains, of plants, beasts, and men, in the lights of heaven, on scored discs of pitch or glass, or in iron filings round a magnet, and in strange conjunctures of chance. That's a translation, actually, that's not mine. Novalis found the magic figures that for him seemed to belong to a great secret language everywhere in nature, on wings and eggshells, in the clouds and in the snow, in crystals and rocks, plants, animals, etc., but also on what he calls berührten und gestrichenen Scheiben von Pech und Glas, which are, of course, not sufficiently translated as scored discs. Some were berührt, affected by a conducting material to cause an electric discharge. Others were bowed with a violin bow. And whereas many readers recognized bowed Chladni glass plates in this passage, Novalis knew of the berührte Scheiben von Pech, the affected discs of pitch or resin, of Lichtenberg's electrophore as well. The ciphers nature wrote in these two instances subverted the educational structures of the Aufschreibesystem 1800. Nature did not make another write. She, in the German grammatical sense, but also as die Frau, the crossed out Frau, woman, wrote herself. And Novalis and his fellow romantics sensed in all those figures, quote, the key of this magic inscription, its language rules. Ahndet man den Schlüssel dieser Wunderschrift, die Sprachlehre derselben. The understanding of the hieroglyphic figures as a secret language, as the secret language of nature that humans just don't have the senses to comprehend anymore, or not yet, pervades all of Romantic literature. These hieroglyphs resemble, in that sense, a pure writing in a Derridian sense, where there doesn't exist any known linguistic sign before writing. This writing was first found and described in a laboratory in Göttingen. Georg Christoph Lichtenberg encountered in 1777 dust formations on the surface of his electrophore, a state-of-the-art electrical device that were soon called after him Lichtenberg figures. Image here. In these figures, electricity began to reveal itself in a novel way. They started electricity's transformation from a curiosity into a technology. The Lichtenberg figures brought a new visual dimension to the field of electrical research. Before Lichtenberg, electricity could mainly be studied by observing sparks and their immediate effects. One famous and fatal case had been the Petersburg scientist Georg Wilhelm Riemann, who was electrocuted by a lightning bolt he himself created or attracted. A fellow researcher in electrical matters, Joseph Priestley, wrote later, "It is not given to every electrician to die in so glorious a manner as the justly envied Riemann." A less damaging quality of these electrical sparks that proved nevertheless cumbersome for an investigator was that they disappeared as quickly as they flared up. In other words, they represented an exceptionally fleeting part of nature. Lichtenberg's figures now conserved the trace of the sparks in an image. Something inherently invisible, electricity, suddenly left a trace that could be preserved, a moment could be arrested and then observed and studied over time. In a poetic narrative that reads like a preview of romantic fiction, Lichtenberg depicted or created the moment of his discovery. In the beginning of spring 1777, the construction of my electrophore had just been completed. The room was still full of resin dust that had accumulated when the cake was being polished. It covered all the walls and books, and with every little whiff of air it was stirred and then, to my great disappointment, often collected on the cover of the electrophore. Once, after I had started to pull up the cover towards the ceiling, dust fell onto the cake. Suddenly, it didn't cover the surface evenly, but, to my great joy, formed little starlets in certain places. In the beginning, these were faint and hardly visible, but when I deliberately sprinkled more dust on the surface, they became clear and beautiful and appeared embossed. At times, countless stars, Milky Ways, and larger suns became visible. The arcs, what did I do? The arcs on their concave side were plain. On their convex side, they were adorned with manifold spouts. Exquisite little branches developed similar to those the frost creates on windows. Lichtenberg seemed in awe of the beauty he had found. Nature definitely performed as the woman that seduced men into speaking and writing poetically. But this time she did it by writing herself. It took Lichtenberg some time to understand that the dust stars appeared in the places where in previous experiments electrical sparks had hit the surface. In today's language and physical knowledge, we could say that he produced surface ionizations, a principle that has come to widespread use in Xerox copy machines. But in Lichtenberg's universe, these images had a whole different meaning. He also, though, began to produce copies by pressing a sticky paper onto the dust stars. He wrote, "This new style of printing was very welcome to me to get ahead quickly, especially since I had neither desire nor time to sketch or destroy all the figures." What excited Lichtenberg was that even when he had just printed one of his figures and thereby removed it, he could easily make it reappear by dusting the electrophore anew. And this way, he not only printed, but actually produced multiple copies of these images of electricity. For Lichtenberg and his colleagues in physics, the study of the properties of electricity was the most important aspect of the figures, but it didn't take long for the beautiful stars to become popular beyond the immediate scientific community. When a few years later, Ernst Florenz Friedrich Chladni introduced sound figures, Klangfiguren, he claimed they were inspired by Lichtenberg's dust figures, which didn't make any sense from a physical point of view, as we already know from Bernhard Siegert. His technique was completely different from anything Lichtenberg ever did. The only connection between the two figures was one fact that soon fascinated Romantics. Nature seemed to write out information about itself that was otherwise inaccessible. Chladni, like Lichtenberg, was interested in physical forces, after electricity, now sound, that resisted analytical study. Chladni drew a violin bow over the edge of a glass or metal plate that he had sprinkled with sand before. Once the plate began to vibrate, the sand was thrown off the parts that were in motion. The images Chladni published with his text appear schematized. In contrast to Lichtenberg, he doesn't seem to have tried to copy them directly onto sticky paper. Significantly, the first collections of patterns Chladni presented look like they're trying to resemble Lichtenberg's starry sun and moon galaxies, even though such patterns materialize rarely through sound, which everyone can see on many YouTube videos of Chladni figures that are out there. So while for Chladni, as much as for Lichtenberg, their figures were primarily a means to study physical phenomena they could not otherwise access, Romantics recognized just how much both of these images differed from any previous scientific illustration. Visual representation used to require a human draftsman, painter, or writer. For Lichtenberg's and Chladni's figures, the human observer only had to build the set or stage on which nature could then perform and inscribe itself. In the Romantic imagination, nature wrote these figures entirely of its or her own accord. Romantics such as Johann Wilhelm Ritter, also Schelling, Novalis, and Hoffmann then read the figures as hieroglyphs that simultaneously represented and hid clandestine knowledge. Just as the Egyptian hieroglyphs were thought to contain the secret wisdom of the ancient cultures, Chladni and Lichtenberg figures seem to hold the secrets that nature wrote. The figures were just as mysterious and meaningful as the leaves in Lintor's magic palm tree library, where Anselmus, guided by Sempertina, effortlessly transcribed the scripts from Mother Nature. This new form of writing came into the world with an electrical spark, and after Lichtenberg had transformed elusive sparks into perpetuating figures in his laboratory, in a next step, Romantics connected sparks and figures in a new understanding of nature, where it or she is no longer a passive subject for investigation, nor a passive object of desire that only waits for men to talk about and describe it. Johann Wilhelm Ritter not only made the conceptual connection between electrical and sound figures even stronger, he also claimed that the symbolized versions of Lichtenberg figures the symbolized versions of Lichtenberg figures could be found as the first and last letters of the oldest alphabets. Hence, his project was, in the footsteps of his fatherly friend Herder, to find, or rather recover, quote from Ritter, the original or natural language by way of electricity. You can read it there, die Ur- oder Naturschrift auf elektrischem Wege wiederfinden. Schelling phrased it in his lectures, quote, nature for us is an ancient author who wrote in hieroglyphs and whose leaves are immense, colossal. Novalis, on the other hand, was most skilled in transposing the figures into romantic poetry already years before E.T.A. Hoffmann. In his famous Ofterdingen tale, the reader encounters an endless number of meaningful figures, bedeutungsvolle Figuren, throughout. An intertwining of Lichtenberg's sparks and Chladni's sound figures builds the stage for a celebration of the great unity of all nature. In one scene, the sound of a gentle but deeply moving music fills a hall. The stars were swinging around in constantly changing lines, sometimes fast and sometimes slow, and they formed the figures according to the music. The music changed incessantly, just like the images on the table, and as strange and hard the transitions sometimes were, the whole seemed connected by one simple theme. At times, they were found all in one big gathering, then again in separate clusters nicely arranged, then the whole long procession dissolved into countless sparks, only to then create through growing circles and patterns one big surprising figure. This great presence and connection of all sorts of figures and their translatability into one another is a recurring topic, especially in this early German Romanticism. In his project for an encyclopedia, Das Allgemeine Brouillon, Novalis wrote a note reminiscent of Ritter's search for the original electrical script. Under the heading Physics and Grammar, we read in Novalis, figured sound movements like as letters. Should the letters have originally been acoustical figures, a priori letters? This is another attempt at understanding figurations written by nature as a form of original alphabet. In Novalis' case, the sound figures become what the Lichtenberg figures represented for Ritter, namely prefigurations of actual readable letters. Novalis writes elsewhere in the Brouillon, you actually have to force sound to imprint, to encode itself on a copper plate. What is interesting about this quote, the term copper plate can, of course, refer to the sometimes also metal plates that Chladni used for his experiments. Much more frequently, though, it was used for the copper plate engravings that were, among other things, used to illustrate books. Reading Novalis from that perspective, it can appear as if the sound doesn't just write, but imprints itself directly into the book. Neither Lichtenberg nor Chladni had been able to do this with their figures, but the Romantic imagination brought natural language and writing in such close proximity with the material medium of the book that both could appear on the same tableau, as we could say with Foucault. In theory, Lichtenberg could have bound the dust prints he took from his electrophore into a book, but only Henry Fox Talbot did exactly that about half a century later, with a different kind of nature writing, his photogenic drawings. These new kinds of drawings or writings, it became after all called photography, light writing. So this new kind of writing took the self-writing of nature to a whole new level. Between 1844 and 46, Talbot produced in weeks of hard labor the first book that contained actual photographs. Together with several assistants, Talbot made photographic prints of 24 paper negatives that he published in installments as The Pencil of Nature. In the end, he had to insert a note because the new medium was too incomprehensible for his contemporaries. The note said, "The plates of the present work are impressed by the agency of light alone, without any aid whatever from the artist's pencil. They are the sun pictures themselves, and not, as some persons have imagined, engravings in imitation." Talbot's French competitor Daguerre referred to the same condition when he wrote, "The daguerreotype is not merely an instrument which serves to draw nature. On the contrary, it is a chemical and physical process which gives her the power to reproduce herself." So nature is reproducing, depicting, writing, or printing itself. Even when they are trying to promote their new discovery, the inventors are completely effacing the technology, their new medium. In that sense, they are heirs of the Romantics that received nature's writing as shibboleth, having registered and forgotten again the technology that inscribed their bodies. As Kittler writes about Bettina Brentano von Arnim, which has been quoted here before, who refused to become a part of the Aufschreibesystem 1800 and subverted it by being ahead of her time in writing, as Kittler writes, eine weibliche, a feminine écriture automatique, die, or which in Kittler's view, keine ist, that isn't one. But what else could be described like this? Quote from Bettina, "So strömen im Dunkel Fluss und Mond und Tinte, so stream, flow in darkness, river, moon and ink." Bettinas Reden, so Kittler, again, Bettinas discourses kommen von anderswoher. They come from elsewhere. And this unconscious flow of writing creates with Kittler a short circuit that disrupts knowledge and education and is Bettinas freedom. Dieser Kurzschluss durchschlägt Wissen und Bildung und ist Bettinas Freiheit. She also came in with a bit of a Kurzschluss into my paper here. But it is this freedom that can be had by simultaneously being ahead of the curve and not submitting under a system, be it even the Aufschreibesystem. Thank you.
I'm fascinated, and I think it's absolutely right to say that nature writing itself is this very important, not only literary topos, but also scientific project. I'm wondering about another moment and how it might how we might even think about it when we're thinking with Kittler, which is when selves write themselves. That is to say, the book, particularly the book that Heinrich discovers in the hermit's cave, inside the mine, and the question there being not one where the laws of nature come into a visible or a written form, but where, in fact, an imagistic form is presented to Heinrich, images of his own life, but the language which accompanies them is a foreign one, which he's completely unable to read. So it seems as though, almost as though the entire figure is turned on its head in that moment. And I'm wondering how we could or couldn't read that alongside the type of writing that we're thinking about, that you've been thinking about with Kittler.
Thank you. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer for that, but I would say that, there is this aspect of incomprehensibility, and that I guess there comes from the language that he can't comprehend. But on the other hand, the hieroglyphs from nature, they are incomprehensible in their own way, sort of. So I wouldn't necessarily see it as entirely different. But yeah, I don't know if I can give you a more elaborate answer to that.
On the one hand, cutting down on the exact correspondence between facial feature and character. On the other hand, this obsession to see significance everywhere. One forward, that's the one we praise. One backward, the reactionary Lichtenberg, nobody wants to talk about. Now, something similar is happening here in Kittler, and I really appreciate your analysis because there's much too little work being done on this great stuff he performs on Hoffmann. On the one hand, you show already in 1800 what normally he associates with 1900. Symbolic mediation gives way to representation, which is actually a direct physical effect of the real. Forward. Yeah. On the other hand, of course, it works backwards. First, you have the idea of the continuity of meaning. Then you can actually think that is meaningful, what is happening there. And this is something that Kittler never really realized. He never saw the double movement there. The second point is a very gratuitous point, because as we're talking about Kittler and women, number one, he is quite simply wrong, arrogant, with his constant insistence that hardly any women were writing. When he says, wenn Frauen ab und zu mal zur Feder griffen, that is BS. We've got so much empirical evidence, and what he never faced up to the question, what actually happens when these women write? What does it say about gender construction? I would like to hear your take on this. What happens when Charlotte von Stein writes against Goethe, her play Dido? How does that fit into the fact, keeping in mind that there are far more Charlotte von Steins than he ever wanted to accept?
I can only say that he was always very careful to pick the things that supported his system. So in that sense, he just didn't look to the others. I mean, that was one of the criticisms also of the Habil reviewers, that he was very selective in sort of pulling his sources. And yeah, so I guess, I mean, I feel that I'm still at the beginning of trying to write against that. And the Charlotte von Stein, Goethe would be probably a good next step to take a closer look. Thank you.
Thank you for the very rich talk. Thinking that genealogy into photography, it intersects with a whole range of natural illustrations, nature prints, Naturselbstdruck, and other contemporaneous techniques, which have this interesting double life in science and also as ornament. And women played crucial roles in that. Mm-hmm. And for right within within the same circle of Talbot and Herschel, you also have famously, Anna Atkins. And I wonder whether, or the question simply is, with nature writing herself, it's always nature, her writing herself, assisted by men in these paradigms, and yet we have the frequent presence of women. So it's really an extension of the same question, not now in the realm of women authors, but rather women who husband nature's writing herself.
Perhaps, yeah, and also men who somehow write their role out of the story in this nature writing. That's what I found interesting, because the early photographers, as well as Lichtenberg and Klein, they all have this tendency to sort of take their role out of the game and make nature sort of be the one who writes on her own accord.
I just wonder if you know of any examples of Kittler looking at curricula in 20th century Germany, such as like at the Bauhaus Dessau, that might have used nature writing or students being exposed to nature to inform their studies of technology, or looking at natural objects and then making fonts, or looking at natural objects and then fastening teapots, or in design outside of the context of the 18th century.
I'm honestly not aware of it, but I also feel that the kind of nature writing that I am talking about, or sort of that I'm interested in, is something that's relatively specific to the 1800 context. And it's actually something that in my reading of it is what then becomes the automatic writing of 1900, which Kittler has studied. And sort of in this strange interaction with technology of being half induced by it, half producing it, which then becomes more of a psychoanalytic method to some extent, and also an art form with the serialist, écriture automatique.
This is sort of follow-up remark to what Jeffy's just said. I mean, first, I'm not really sure whether the fact that we have these self-writings of nature can be, at least to full extent, used against Kittler. I mean, as a contradiction to his statement, argument that nature is voice, men are the writers, the authors. Because as Noam just said, this writing needs this, what Kittler would have called this priesthood, you know, this Priesterschaft, that is dancing around mother, you know, and without all these priests dancing around this Naturschrift, that Naturschrift would not have a place in the discourse network of 1800. So that is the place of it, and according to Kittler, I mean, that is what you would say. Second, as Geoffrey already with Blumenberg indicated, I think one should at least mention that that was if you look at Romanticism as some kind of media historical event or chance or start of something, as when you showed us the Talbot and as a possible consequence of that, one should not forget that that actually the romanticist take to it, namely to try to read it as something, as a signifier, as an hermeneutical system of kind of alphabet, that was a dead end, and that led to nothing, and that the true media historical relevance of that happened in that moment when Kant used Chladni's figure as a model of how the brain water could be organized, and therefore not taking the Chladni figures as a meaning system, but as an operational system, as something that could organize sensory data. And of course, that was the step forward, if I may say so, in a very traditional way, for which I apologize. but you see, I mean, from that, then Sommering invented the electric telegraph, and then on that line, this whole story went on. Sommering reading Kant and so on. The story is known. And
from the telegraph then to photography?
I don't really see that, but and that's.
So I mean, because
yeah.
I
don't
goes to the telegraph, but I would still say that my side goes to the photograph.
Yeah, but I don't. I think that would be really complicated to see photography as. I mean, all right, one could try. There is this connection but it's a complicated one. It's a very complicated, and as far as I know the story, it cannot be proved. I mean, of course, we have Ritter, we have Faraday coming to read Ritter, that is proven. We have Ørsted, and we have Talbot as being somehow a friend of Faraday. And so there is a connection that can be constructed, but what it technically means, because two systems are completely different. There's one has to do with static electricity, and the other has something to do with chemistry, and so it's a very metaphorical connection, if I may say so. Whereas the direct, what can be proven is that what really happened with Naturschrift, the way that Naturschrift took out of Romanticism to become what Kittler would have called implemented. Now, it had been implemented first in Kant's Brainwater, and then through Kant's Brainwater into Summering's first telegraph, and then it vanished and became just vanished to give rise to electrical media of communication.
But I guess,
I mean, that's not important, but I mean, that is, I find it interesting what happened to Mother there. I mean, that is what I learned from you. I mean, and I think it's very, very interesting to think about that, if that is true. And I think you're right, that here we have this manifestation in writing of the Mother, what it means to a history of technical media, that the operational or becoming operational of the Mother is then, at least in my version of the history, telegraphy.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of, but so then where, in your version, where does photography come from? Or does it just appear somehow out of nowhere? Because, I mean, the one thing that can be proven is that Ritter, I mean, he found the ultraviolet rays through a proto-photographic process in the end. So I don't know. I mean, I guess part of my argument that I didn't bring up here is also to take the history, or this, like, the invention, discovery of photography out of an art historical sort of story that puts it entirely in the context of the development of landscape painting and this and that, and sort of to understand it, as a media history and media technology. Maybe I'll at some point find the way to prove it to you.
In a kind of variation to what has just been discussed, it seems to me the question, so to speak, to Kittler arriving from your material may perhaps not be so much the question if we tell the story from the point of view of Chladni, but in the moment when we tell it from the point of view of Lichtenberg, to explain a little bit what I have in mind, perhaps the easier version, kind of parallel version to what you showed us in the history of Lichtenberg's aphorism, the Sudelbücher. And the moment he died, they became for the first time collected and printed. And the first and the one writing a review on the first edition of this collected work of Lichtenberg, including the fragments of the Sudelbücher, was Schleiermacher, who immediately said, if you begin to edit something, you have to edit everything, and then we have the history of his mind. So, in this case, it's very, very easy to say. I mean, the Kittler moment is certainly in the moment where Schleiermacher says, you have to edit everything. It's perhaps already in a certain way in the moment the son and the disciple decide to publish something from the Sudelbücher, which never were destined to be published, as far as we know. But they are just Lichtenberg people. So it's hard to understand what they thought they were doing when they published that. But what the hell was Lichtenberg doing in the first place? So and you see what I mean? So to speak, Schleiermacher is here, so to speak, the moment of implementation in a certain way, yeah? And that's, so to speak, easy to grasp in Kittlerian vocabulary, what he's doing. But what is Lichtenberg doing? Or perhaps that's not a Kittlerian question, or but whatever. But I thought that was something very parallel to this medium, and perhaps it's not just by coincidence and parallel.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's an interesting point, actually. I haven't really considered the Sudelbücher in parallel with that. Even though, actually, in the Sudelbücher, now that I'm remembering it, there is the passage from Lichtenberg where he thinks about if it wouldn't be or shouldn't be possible to make the images of the camera obscura stay on the paper.
Thank you, Antje, very much for coming back to the home ground and to for your presentation, which included a number of framing devices that were rather remarkable, and I don't know if they contain your talk or actually subvert your talk in certain ways. The wonderful distinction you made between the rehab and the of the Denkwürdigkeiten and Kittler's Habil. So I thought that was very important to underscore and also kind of rewrite institutional boundaries and markers within which you were somehow working nature and the Wunderschrift, as well as other motifs and topoi that you made us think about today. I want to thank you for that very much. But I'll just cut to the chase and ask you a little bit about the what you think about the, if this engages you at all. I'm just making friends again with you right now and thanking you, basically. But you know the subversive spark, and I'm trying to follow the electric sparks that you flashed to us. I'm wondering, just following a particular logic in the idiom that you were advocating perhaps today, do you think this was a way in Lichtenberg or elsewhere of trying to struggle with untranslatabilities? Because didn't it allow for some sort of almost catastrophic translatability? Do you know what I'm talking about at all here? Does it?
I'm trying.
Okay. Because it seemed to me that somehow the sparking and the electric currency allowed for sudden explosions of new tropologies that you see in that Mary Shelley, who was in love with Andrew Cross, the great electrician, who helped ignite that unnameable monster, son of Victor Frankenstein, right? Yeah. So there was something about a monstrosity and the monstrosity of untranslatability that suddenly made things seem translatable in this nature Schrift und so weiter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly if Lichtenberg already had it. I mean, the Romantics definitely, that untranslatability, that with the sparks and figures and things like that. But I'm sort of, because Lichtenberg, he has been mentioned as the big Enlightenment, Aufklärungsfigure. I see him as very much between all sorts of chairs of like Enlightenment or Romanticism, and so in that sense, I'm taking your cue to look back at him in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much.